Everybody for having me here today. My name is Jen Wilcox and I lead the team at the Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management. And also we recently reorganized our office as effective September 12th, and we've also added this name, the two words that are pretty important to what we do, which is carbon management, to the title. But before I talk about the infrastructure funding, I just want to give a little bit of an overview of what we're doing in our office. So we're really looking at across the entire supply chain of how we are dependent on fossil fuels today, looking at coal, oil, and natural gas. And not just looking at how they are used in looking at mitigation or pollution control surrounding the facilities by which we use fossil fuels for energy generation, but we also care about how we are extracting them from the earth today. And we really want to make sure that the efforts, when we look at a demonstration project for CCS, for instance, for carbon capture and storage, that we're not decoupling these two. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the funding as it relates to these pieces. So again, thinking about our dependence on fossil fuels today, we use them for generating electricity. We use them for heating, for industrial heat, in particular looking at cement, steel, and even hydrogen production. And so our office has invested in looking at the decarbonization of the power sector, using fossil fuels as a feedstock, decarbonization of industrial sectors, and also not just that decarbonization piece, the carbon capture at the point source, but the methane mitigation, for instance, is another area that we're investing in. As you extract, for instance, natural gas out of the earth, being able to understand how much methane is associated with that extraction, all the way from the production upstream from the well pad, through the gathering lines, through the transmission system, to where you're actually using it at a facility. And so these are really important pieces that we want to look at. If we're generating, for instance, low carbon electricity, we want to make sure that the CO2 or the greenhouse gas emissions are minimized across the entire supply chain, across the entire process. A lot of what we invest in is engineering design studies as well. So ahead of a pilot or ahead of a demonstration, we want to make sure that the project is technically feasible. And we have in the infrastructure law, $3.5 billion collectively associated with these engineering design studies, pilots, but also demonstrations associated with carbon capture and storage. Again, a big focus of what we're looking at is not just the sectors that we're dependent upon today that are sourced from fossil fuels, but those that are expected to be committed through mid-century. And so when we look at the power sector, it's not that CCS is a blanket solution across all fossil fuel fired power plants, but we look at what is the infrastructure that's expected to persist through mid-century, and that those are really good targets for potentially for CCS. And then same with some of the industrial sectors where it's difficult, for instance, in the case of cement production, to replace that process with, say, renewables, because there's not just the heat required to calcine limestone for cement production, but it's actually a chemical reaction where you start with limestone and you produce process emissions through heating the limestones and you produce CO2. And so carbon capture is one method where you can actually decarbonize both the heat, but also the process emissions associated with the cement production process. So looking at CCS is really an approach, again, not a blanket solution, but it's a good approach for some of these industrial sectors and also for committed emissions. The other piece that I want to point out is once we capture all of the CO2, what do we do with it? And we need to make sure that we have a solution that scales with the emissions, and that's on the order of gigatons. And so one effort that we've been investing in over the last 2 decades is deep geological storage of CO2. The infrastructure law provides $2.5 billion of funds associated with deep geologic storage. And this is an area that we could really use the states and their expertise and assistance. Currently, 2 states, North Dakota and Wyoming, have Class 6 primacy. So in order to inject CO2 in a dedicated way underground, you need a Class 6 well. And that's a permit from the Environmental Protection Agency. And Currently, though, there's also the option of this primacy, but only 2 states actually have primacy. If you're thinking about a demonstration project, typically it takes about 18 months in order to really get one of these permits. And so there's a pretty significant line or queue at EPA in terms of submitting. So all of this timing has to be factored into when you actually get to do the demonstration project. If a state has Class 6 primacy, it speeds this up. Rather than over a year, it can take on the order of months to get the permits. And so one thing that we want to do is to be able to work with the states in order to gain that expertise within the state so that we can have that primacy and then more opportunities for doing the CO2 dedicated storage projects. West Virginia, Louisiana, Arizona are all officially in the pipeline for state primacy today. Texas and Oklahoma have expressed interest, but it's a process that takes time. And really gaining this primacy leverages the in-state expertise and can, again, significantly speed up the permitting process. The infrastructure law actually has funding for states through the Environmental Protection Agency. The Class 6 primacy application process, there's $50 million up to 2026. And so this is really specific for guiding states and assisting to work with EPA to gain primacy. In addition, the EPA's Groundwater Protection Council has a working group to assist states in gaining primacy. And I'm emphasizing this because we're talking about so much capturing of the CO2, and we need a place to put the CO2. And when we look at the projects that we have in the United States today for dedicated storage, we have 5 programs where we can inject CO2 deep underground. It's called our Carbon Safe program. And so we really, this is really going to be a bottleneck in terms of doing our CCS demonstration projects if we don't have a place to put the CO2. The other piece that I want to talk about that's also in the infrastructure funding is investing in carbon dioxide removal. And so it's become clear that avoiding CO2 emissions from entering the atmosphere is no longer enough for meeting climate goals. And we have our net zero greenhouse gas emissions goal by 2050, and avoiding carbon emissions and decarbonization are a big part of the portfolio, but we also have to recognize that there are sectors that are really difficult to decarbonize today. I talked about CCS and those examples. Those are approaches that we actually do have technologies today for decarbonization. But when we look at the agricultural sector and methane emissions associated with agriculture, when we look at aviation and shipping and the availability of sustainable aviation fuel today, we recognize that there are just sectors that are very, very difficult to avoid emissions today. And this is the role that carbon dioxide removal will have to play. And so it's a critical tool to achieving net zero. And it's a broad range of approaches that remove CO2 directly from the accumulated pool in the atmosphere. So very different from point source carbon capture. And in November at COP26, the Department of Energy launched the carbon negative shot, which is cross-cut across all of our applied offices and also the Office of Science. So EERE, Nuclear, Office of Science, and ARPA-E, including FECM, launched this effort. And looking at all different ways to take CO2 out of the atmosphere. It could be planting trees, but making sure that you're planting trees in a way that is reduced risk for forest fire, so that your sink doesn't become a source of emissions. It could be increasing carbon stored in soils. It could be direct air capture, which is an approach that uses minerals, chemicals, or even biological systems that pull CO2 directly out of the atmosphere. And so a broad range of approaches. The carbon negative shot, though, is really about investing in the R&D across all of these sectors and also in this cross-cut way. In terms of the infrastructure law, $3.5 billion associated with demonstrations on direct air capture in particular. Again, not just using chemicals, but using minerals, even using biological systems to take CO2 out of the atmosphere. But what we're really looking at is leveraging the investments that we've made and also being able to choose projects that not just capture the CO2, but also do it in a way that's permanent, and that the CO2 storage is durable in order to really have an impact, a positive impact on climate. And so I wanted to just emphasize the distinction, which is what we're really trying to do in our Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management, the distinction of these two tools of managing carbon. We can manage carbon by avoiding the emissions from entering the atmosphere in the first place. And we can also manage carbon by actually taking the CO2 from the accumulated pool out of the atmosphere. But that carbon removal tool should not be seen as an approach to offset emissions where we have the technologies, where we're investing through bill and our appropriations in technologies to decarbonize, because it'll always be cheaper and easier to avoid the emissions in the first place, especially as we advance these technologies. The other thing that I want to mention is that associated with the demonstration and infrastructure funding, that these demonstrations are going to be deployed ultimately in communities, and that it's going to be so important that we have on the ground local stakeholder support and advocacy for these projects, for these demonstration projects, which I think is another way that the states can play a really critical role. Again, coming from the Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management, there's legacy impacts associated with our dependence on fossil fuels in communities. And so a lot of what we are doing is also being able to communicate these approaches, and also being able to recognize the co-benefits that some of these investments will have in communities. I'll just give a couple of examples. When we look at a direct air capture approach with carbon removal, you could imagine placing this technology, provided coupled to low carbon energy, and that's regionally available. But you could imagine placing it, for instance, in a highly polluted area like a port. Again, a region that may be hard to decarbonize in the near term. But one of the co-benefits of direct air capture is that you're not just capturing CO2, you're actually capturing other hazardous pollutants from the atmosphere as well. And so that's a co-benefit. In fact, the chemicals, in some cases the minerals that are used to capture CO2 from the atmosphere, they don't work unless they first scrub the other pollutants out. And so that's a co-benefit that's built into the process. But there are a lot of other carbon removal approaches that, you can see these co-benefits. And so this could be a strategy where we really engage with communities. We're also seeing this when we look at the deep geologic storage of CO2. What does it mean to store a gas underground, even though the gas is CO2 and we use it for carbonated beverages and it's pretty benign? But it can be, alarming if you're not understanding what the technology is and you're not understanding what the risks and the approaches are. And so more of this engagement, more interactions with frontline communities where the technologies are actually going to be deployed is something that's going to be really important as we think about these projects and as we think about citing these projects moving forward. And so really excited to be here today and have the opportunity to have this discussion. With that, I'm going to hand it off to my colleague, Pat Hoffman, who heads up the Office of Electricity.